And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Hope your new year is starting out with a bang and with all good things. And hey, you know what? My Razorbacks won. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. They gone from not winning a single Southeast Conference game in 2 years and barely winning 2 or 3 games per year to this year winning 9 games, including the bowl game. Absolutely fantastic. I would do this woo pig suey, but I guess I better not. My wife says, no, don't do that. So anyway, and now we are set, at the time that I'm making this, here we are Tuesday morning, and so next Monday night, we have the championship game between Alabama and Georgia. Now, if you're not a football fan, this doesn't mean anything to you, but if you're a football fan, you love this stuff. I mean, Alabama and Georgia, rematch, boy, this promises to be an absolutely fantastic game. So, anyway, absolutely love it. And once again, thank you for joining me here on Morning Musings. We are beginning our investigation of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, which is the last of Jesus' parables in the Olivet Discourse. We are told by exegetes and commentators this absolutely has to be an end of the world, end of time scenario. Now, I've already shared with you in yesterday's video some of the problems, and we're going to be examining those issues even more as we progress. But in preparation for that, just take notice. Get yourself a piece of paper. On one hand, go to Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Notice the constituent elements. Parallel them with Matthew 25, 31 and following. Go to Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31. List the parallels on the right-hand side. It's just absolutely astounding. So anyway, that's kind of an assignment for you for where we're going. As I suggested already, as with Matthew 25, 31 and following, if we are not aware of the Old Testament source for Jesus' parable, we will have a tendency, and this is precisely what happens in the commentaries, we will have a tendency to interpret Matthew 25, 31 and following, not from the perspective of the Old Testament prophetic sources, but from a New Testament perspective, divorced from, distinct from the Old Testament. And as I pointed out, when we were talking about, for instance, the coming of the Son of Man for the wedding, that's based upon God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel that in the last days he would return and remarry Israel. So that raises the question, if the parable of the coming of the Son of Man would be in fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel to remarry her in the last days, then does that not indicate, does that not at least imply and infer that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is likewise a parable of the coming of the Son of, pardon me, the coming of the Son of Man in his kingdom, which is taken from the Old Testament. And I think that is exactly and precisely what is going on in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Now, to set the stage for this, let's go to Acts chapter 2. In Acts chapter 2, as the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all gathered together in one place, and suddenly there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and there was heard a sound of a rushing mighty wind, And cloven tongues sat on each of them as they began to speak in tongues. An amazing, utterly amazing incident. The crowd was amazed and began to say, how hear we every man speaking in our own tongue wherein we were born? And there were Parthians and Edes and Elamites, those of Macedonia, those of Achaia, those of Asia. There were Jews and devout men, proselytes, from every nation under heaven, we are told. Some scoffers began to say, these men are drunken. I mean, what in the world's going on here? Peter, standing up with the 11, said, men of Israel, hear these words. Let this be known to you. These men are not drunken as you suppose, seeing it's but the third hour of the day. But this is that which was spoken. Oh my goodness. Allergies have been raging last couple of days. I apologize, but we continue. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, saying, it shall come to pass in the last days, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall dream dreams. Your old men shall see visions. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he quotes verbatim from Joel 2:28 and following from the Septuagint. So obviously, Joel foretold the events of Pentecost and following. Because the Lord said, I will show wonders in the sky above. The sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light. Stars of heaven shall be shaken. I will show signs before the great and the terrible day of the Lord. Now remember, Peter said, this is that. Now that doesn't mean that every single thing that happened on the day of Pentecost was the fulfillment. Because after all, God said, I'm going to show signs in the heaven above and in the earth beneath. Blood, fire, vapor of smoke. Before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Well, blood, fire, vapor of smoke didn't happen on that day as signs of the day of the Lord. So we have to look elsewhere for that. So Acts chapter 2 is the beginning of the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. But it began a process of fulfillment in the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, not just on Israel, but on all flesh. As Peter said, the promise is to you, to your children, to all who are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. Well, he called the Gentiles, and he poured his Spirit out upon the Gentiles. That didn't happen at Pentecost. Now, there were representatives, as the text says, from every nation under heaven. So in that sense, we can see the expansive fulfillment. But here's the point. The events of Pentecost are, once again, without any doubt, the beginning of the fulfillment of Joel. But that means that the events of Pentecost were the events of the last days. Now, notice that Peter did not say that the events of Pentecost initiated or began the last days. I was raised in a fellowship that said, when Peter stood up and said, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, that he was saying, guess what, folks? The last days have begun today. No, I'm sorry. Christ appeared in the last days, but Christ appeared before Pentecost. Therefore, the last days existed before Pentecost. See how simple that is? Now, let me encourage you. Don't forget, for the rest of the month of January 2022, U.S. orders only. If you go to my website and you order over $25 or $25 or more of materials, doesn't matter what it is, all right, then you'll get a 15% discount plus free shipping. One of the books, let me recommend that you get, is the book, The Last Days Identified. Now, like I said, I was raised believing that the last days began on Pentecost. However, the more I studied the scriptures, the more I realized that is absolutely fallacious. The Christian age is not identified as the last days. The last days are to be identified with the last generation of Israel's Old Covenant existence. So here we have Peter quoting from Joel, saying these events are events of the last days, not events establishing the last days. And how does that correlate to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following? Well, let's see. In Matthew 25, 31 and following, what do we find? We have the coming of the Son of Man, when he shall sit upon the throne of his glory, coming with the angels in power and great glory. Then all the nations would be gathered before him. Now, watch this. Peter affirms that Joel chapter 2 was beginning to be fulfilled that day, and Joel chapter 3 tells us that in the days of the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2, 28 and following, in those days, what days? In those last days, not only would the Lord pour out his Spirit, but in those last days, watch, and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations. So what do we have here? We have the conflation of the idea of the restoration of Israel leading to the gathering of the nations. Do you catch the power of that? Once we understand that the last days are the focus here, okay, and that the last days are not the last days of time, they are not the last days of the Christian age, they are not the last days of the Messianic age, they are the last days of the Old Covenant age of Israel. It would be in those days, and at that time, the last days of Old Covenant Israel, that the Lord would gather the nations. Once we understand the identity of the last days, ladies and gentlemen, then Matthew chapter 25 takes on a totally different meaning for us. To reiterate, once we understand that the last days are the last days of the Old Covenant age of Israel, that means that the gathering of the nations would be in the last days of Israel's Old Covenant existence. That means Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is not therefore about, about the gathering of the nations at the end of the Christian age which has no end. And boy, yeah, we've got more on this. So I'll see you on the flip side.